I've been looking forward to this reading a great deal. Bill is the co-editor with Michael McDowell of Windfall. He's been doing that since 2002, a journal of poetry of place. If after the reading tonight you go on Google and you take a look at some of the things that come up, maybe some of you have already done it, there will be issues of Windfall magazine with some delightful examples of Bill's work. Clackamas Lake, Wind Mountain were two of the ones that I looked at today, and places that I have been in different hikes that I have taken. Bill has published 3 books of poetry. Parzival, 1981, A Journey from Lewiston, Idaho to San Francisco, Ireland, and Portland. Phoenix Fire, 1987, consisting mostly of anti-nuclear political poems, and The Turn, 2000, which tells of travels in Europe, mostly in Germany, before and after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But when we talked about scheduling Bill's reading, he has a new book coming out, Clearwater Way, and we all hope that that would already be out or coming out immediately this month. But it's been delayed just a little bit, but it is coming out soon. Clearwater Way takes the form of a journey from Seaview, Washington, up the Columbia and Snake Rivers to Lewiston and in the Clearwater River country of Idaho. Bill taught at the University of Hawaii for 3 years and has lived in Portland since 1972. He taught literature and composition at Portland Community College for 25 years. I didn't get a chance to talk to him about that, him coming from Hawaii to Portland, but we don't know. We'll see. Maybe he'll talk a little bit about that in terms of poetry of place. It's delightful. We are delighted here to have him as our February reader. And now it is a real pleasure for us to welcome our poet and reader tonight, Bill Siverly. Bill.
There is a chair up here if someone would care to sit. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all here. And this is a wonderful series. I've had the good fortune to be able to attend most of them over the last 2 years. And I encourage you to come to the ones the week after and the week after, or the month after and the month after, okay, because they'll be great. As well as the future readings that I hope this series continues. So thanks to Tom Hogan and the committee here at the Leading Library for this series. So tonight I'd like to read one poem from each of the books that I have out. And these books, of course, are back there at the table. One called Parzival, written back in 78 to 1980. I think that goes back a ways. Doesn't this look like a product of the 80s? Nobody does soft covers anymore, but it's, in fact, John Larson is the one who did this book. It has a Press 22 bookmark on it, and it was in a kind of a converted garage on southeast Portland, right, where he both lived over the press and worked on the press downstairs, a big creaky old press that did a beautiful job in printing this. So I'm just going to read the end of this. Parzival is based on a long medieval poem by Wolfram von Eschenbach, right, about the search for the Holy Grail. Parzival, you may remember, among the knights, was considered the fool. So he was young, constantly making mistakes out of arrogance, and he was able to see the Grail, but never able to achieve it. Right? That was left to Galahad, who was pure in heart. But Parzival didn't qualify. Fools don't make it. But so this is the very last poem. It's just called Canto 36, and the 36th poem in the book. Parzival is gone like leaves, leaving behind torn shield, rusting greaves, that suit of armor I call my youth. It is November now in Raven country, and I am standing at the edge of a frost-covered field, secretly happy. The city of winter is here, awkward ravens picking through trash in the streets, shouting ka at each other, ka, Egyptian glyph for the soul, that double-breasted embrace that waits for you on the other side. Already I hear the flowering spring, Alcaios sang. After 2,500 years, a sage may appear who knows what it means. Someday, someone like me will wake up, turning off the dark freeway to find his love again. A distant field of wheat lies prostrate at the feet of blue mountains under the dreamless heat of August. You can almost see the ruined barn, the rusty bucket nailed to the wall. You can almost hear the voices of children springing like fire up into the bright air. Ripped off the last two lines from Bacchylides. 1987, I did a small book called Phoenix Fire, the cover by Sharon Bronson, who, by the way, does all the covers for our magazine, Windfall. So she's been a long-time friend. She and I happen to have been born on the very same day, so in the same year. So this, I was sort of wanting to break up the literary and mythological thing I was on with Parzival. So I decided to completely do something different and write political poetry, which in the 1980s was pretty hard to come by in this country. In fact, almost every other country in the world had great political poetry, and I was kind of inspired by Otto René Castillo in Guatemala, Roque Dalton in El Salvador, Pablo Neruda, Bertolt Brecht. A lot of, in fact, I ended up teaching a course at PCC called International Political Poetry, which I more or less designed and researched and taught for a number of years. My students tend to like this book more than any other. It's because it's political. It's Bill Siverly trying to teach himself how to write a political poem because they didn't have much in the way of models to work with. So, and the main theme of this is anti-nuclear poetry, because in the 1980s, you may remember, the Reagan administration was actually fomenting the idea that a nuclear war was winnable. Okay? And therefore, I think Robert Scheer wrote a book called With Enough Shovels, based on some administration official that said, with enough shovels, we can all protect ourselves from nuclear war. Dig fast. So, but Reagan also kept trying to make, he made gestures towards disarmament with Gorbachev, you may remember from those eras. And there's a couple of meetings. There's one called in Geneva, especially, that they met, but they didn't really do it, didn't really get into disarmament enough or agree. So this is called the Geneva Elegies, November 1985. Listen for some resonances to today. The thing about political poetry, you think it's ephemeral, so I didn't spend a lot of money on this book. but as a matter of fact, it keeps coming back round again. Number one, how do we save ourselves in time from our compulsion to prevail? How do we stave off annihilation long enough to cut a deal with fate? Saxons, we have come to the end of capital formation. We have come to the end of our appetite for manganese and uranium, the half-lives of women and children. We have come to the end of oppression. 2. The great fear of contradiction means regional disputes get no attention. The dissident and the neutral continue to be hunted down by generals, trained to serve themselves and their owners, and no other future forever. We must resist the slide into chaos, give up Star Wars, suspend all surrogate counter-revolutions, restrain the ravenous banks and businessmen. 3. Men who rule the world, how could you meet and not resolve the threat of nuclear war? You could have been the hero twins, or Christ himself and the Holy Ghost come back to save the race. Agents of profit beware. Now is the twilight of large returns, the decline of congenital greed, the transfer of property back to the stars. I was thinking of Carl Sagan. We are star-ish, contemplating the stars. Remember? the Cosmos series on TV. So then, in 2000, all of these books were produced by me, and this is the second one done by John Larson, designed by him. So, who does a great book, a beautiful book, always a beautiful print and design. But this one is called The Turn after a phrase in German called Die Wende, right, which is the huge turn that took place when the Berlin Wall came down. Right? This, of course, had an enormous effect in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, right, and was kind of almost passed by over here. A lot of celebration, oh, we won, and the rest, but over there it was like an entire life-changing experience. And for many people who grew up all their lives with the idea of a bipolar world, the communists and us, right, and to have all of that fall away was actually kind of a tremendous effect. I'm married to a German person, Jutta Donat, right here. And Jutta and I were not in Germany in 1989. We were in Washington, D.C. at the moment the wall fell. We were attending a humanities conference, actually, in Washington, D.C. First time either one of us had been there. So November 9th was the day, actually, the wall came down, 1989. Can you remember back that moment? So this will remind you of all of the hopes and everything that were set loose at that moment. I mentioned a couple of things in here. Francis Bacon is a painter. Some of you know he was still alive then. He died in 92. He had a great show at the Hirshhorn at that time. Mention of Silesian. Jutta is from the part of Germany called Silesia, way out in the eastern part, the easternmost city in Silesia is Görlitz. In Germany is Görlitz. So, basically, casually we slipped away from the humanistic convention in the Hyatt Regency, finding our way to the 8th floor bed, overlooking D.C.'s mean autumnal streets, for a long delayed encounter between the sheets. Later, like sated Romans, we tuned in CNN to see the world from its center, the daily labor of legions under orders from the Capitol. Instead, we saw the breakdown of the wall, erected in our childhoods back in '61, standing all our lives between our words and the unspoken desire to redeem the loss of home, the unfinished dream. Berliners cheered the first graffiti-covered slab chiseled free and hoisted away, East Germans pouring like relief from your Silesian eyes. But I, at the end of a dubious age, had reason to doubt the promise of freedom granted by Rome, recalling Bacon's images seen only yesterday, the screaming Pope and the bloody sides of meat, the overdosed dead lover embracing a toilet seat. The next day we would join 300,000 women, demanding at Lincoln's feet their reproductive rights that men still pretend to control. Men like to assume that nature and history comes to an end, but I have seen them both come round again. At the monument to the fallen in Vietnam, that long angular double wedge of stone set into the earth, spellbound survivors filing slowly by in both directions. I reached out to touch my cousin's name. And behind his chiseled serifs, my own mask of pain suddenly confronted me from deep within the wall. Meanwhile, we find once more that kind of joy that lovers know when all their children have gone. People milling around the Brandenburg Gate, who on a single day discover hope regained, that a century of pain shall not repeat itself, but change. Surely we can expect more of life on earth than history come to an end in the hands of the strong, dividing the rest of us by walls or drawing lines in sand. Surely the ancient law of eternal return, long forgotten by all but tribal people in retreat, yet keeping itself in force even under the asphalt, shall carry our human potential into the future, stripping our awkward alienation away. Surely today we turn from the dream of autonomy, resume the dialogue broken by war, and render each other the tender gift of community. Or so we'd like to believe above our darkling plain, its temperature rising, the ocean submerging the coastline, wind, rain, and rocks so laced with contamination they call our bodies back before their time, your father and mine. Though nothing lives long but rivers and mountains, we'd like to believe that we could outlast Rome. By hunger's choice and Auden's song, love one another or die. We have no choice but to comply, as lovers know so well, never out of touch, always something more to tell, and never enough time for passion's expression, always hovering like confession just on the tip of the tongue. By such sweet contradictions we come home, to the heyday of hope and the consummation of dreams. We sleep and wake in the arms of eternal return. That sound like 1989?
Sounds like a vision from the scene.
Yeah. There was a lot of hope set loose by the events. There's I think, a little piece that was handed out to you called Castletotal. Is anybody aware of where Castletotal might be? All right, it was an Indian village. It was both the name of the village and the people.
British Columbia?
No, it's actually closer. Right, it's where the Lewis River comes into the Columbia and the Lake River meets there. It's like three rivers.
I'm
And
trying to figure out the three rivers. I'm
Yeah.
studying North American
yeah,
Native American history.
yeah,
The Northwest, and just trying to figure out where those three rivers would be.
yeah.
But I know
It's
it
great.
was
It's
like
in the
Dallas.
Ridgefield Wildlife Refuge, about 15 miles north of here.
Yeah, there's some.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, there's a plank house up there that has been built. It's a model of what, when Lewis and Clark came down, they saw 14 of those plank houses in this place. Every once in a while it would flood, right? And the Indians would just basically lift up their houseboards and all their possessions and go to higher ground and let the flood clean out all the fleas and dirt and everything, and then come back and put it all back together. So it didn't matter that it was on low ground or that it flooded. But and archaeologists have discovered, I think, about 6 of the locations for those houses. Right? So this is partly about that plank house. I urge you all to go up and take a look at it. It gives you an immediate insight into what Native American pre-contact life was sort of like. I mean, you get a sort of an idea of what it was like. And it's the house is not located exactly where the village was, but the village was 200 yards or something off Fairly.
That's right in Ridgefield.
Yeah, right in Ridgefield. So we look at this and it says, as long as oil from distant lands can still deliver us to destinations on demand, we drive the Range Rover north to Ridgefield, 3,000 folks and 800 homes. That's the population of Ridgefield. Many commute by asphalt to Vancouver, some from mass-produced gingerbread mansions, sited on the ridge like churches of money, overlooking wildlife and wetlands far below. Overlooking the plank house reconstructed there, we enter the circular doorway to a dim interior world. 80 feet of living space along a central fire pit. Carved house posts of ancestors looming at the back. Sliding planks overhead, venting smoke from ancient fires. Homeward bound, Lewis and Clark camped the night where 3 rivers merge, where Cathlopodal made their way by swift canoe through rich spirit worlds of salmon, blue jay, elk, and wapato. 900 Cathlopodal, by Clark's count, dwelled in 14 plank lodges. Suddenly we realize, when all the oil is gone, everyone we know will live in one room. Isn't that a terrific idea? So, like how many people live in each house in Ridgefield? This poem calls for math, right? About 3, little under 4. About 4 individuals in each house in Ridgefield. And how many down in Cathlopodal at the other end of the poem? Right. Well, we've got 14 lodges, and we've got 900 people. That's closer to, it's around 67, so roughly 70. Okay. When Yuta and I got married, we had a reception, and we invited all of our colleagues, all of our family, all of our friends, and it came to 70 people. All right, so that showed up for this particular occasion. So roughly, say, if all of you knew 70 people, and I had to include your immediate family, especially your in-laws, and you're all living in the same 80 feet of living space along a central fire pit. Right? I think it's the disparity between the way we live and the way people once lived is so huge and so unsustainable, right? That we're going to move closer to something like that probably in the future, rather than more of Ridgefield's current solution. But it's especially when you can't. All the oil is so expensive that you can't be doing all of the running around that is required to sustain a place like Ridgefield, right, in relation to larger. So this poem also, that central line in the very middle stanza has 5 lines, right? And so it's 80 feet of living space along a central fire pit is a very central idea of this poem. It doesn't sound like much, but that's what you would have. That's what you have to contend with. If you go to visit this plank house, that's what you will see. Right? So, and then the second stanza is sort of parallel to the 4th stanza, which is about the way they travel and the way they live. Right? And even in the middle stanza, you're outside the house in the first 2 lines of it, and in the last 2 lines of it, you're inside the house. So it's like parallelism. That's the structures I use in poems. I got it basically from oral poetry. The Iliad is structured like this, right? With the great battle in the middle of the Iliad, it's right in the center of it, and everything goes up to it and away from it in a parallel fashion. Right? That's really how the oral poets remembered things, not so much by meter and rhyme, but by what Robert Bringhurst calls thematic prosody. What happens here, and what happens here, and what happens here, and then how it's reflected in what happens down here. So that's everyone we know will live in one room. That's a poem I wrote in around 2006. So that's outside of any book, anything so far. But it's a refined example of what I'm trying to work with. It's in Native American myth-telling, and it's in ancient oral poetry in the West as well. That structure lasted all the way up to about 1200. It's Parzival, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, structured that way. I think Good Friday is at the middle. And everything builds up and away from it. So, but then literacy, the novel, right, took over, and that whole system was parallelism is in the Princeton Handbook on Poetry gets a little almost dismissed. Right? But actually it's powerful. And it was for a long time and still is a very powerful way to organize. So I thought I'd read some poems in from Clearwater Way, which exists only in manuscript at this point. Probably will be coming out this summer. Eric Muller at Trap Rock Books. It'll be the 21st book of poetry he's produced. And he's done a great job. It's in Eugene, but there are many Trap Rock books about. You can find them at Looking Glass. Right? And this book is, as Tom was saying, a journey, another journey, right? I'm doing these journeys, except for Phoenix Fire. Right? The books are all journeys. Back in San Francisco days, where I studied poetry at San Francisco State, I got this idea that basically you should write poems in books. That I think the poet Jack Spicer had a huge influence on me. I don't know if any of you know him. His collected works just came out this year from Wesleyan University Press. You should get a hold of that. It's interesting. But he wrote in books, a book at a time. He said, no poem is by itself alone. Right? It relates to the others that you're writing at a particular time. And so Parzival's book, right? The Turn, they're all grouped closely. Although Phoenix Fire is a little more razzmatazz because the only theme holding it together is anti-war, basically, anti-nuclear war. But so this is another journey. This time starting at Seaview, Washington coast, going up the Columbia River, then at Pasco, the Snake River comes in, and so it follows the Snake River. Although, don't spend too much time. That's a huge amount of landscape right there. It's about 340 miles to Lewiston, right, where I was born and grew up. And then the book sits for a section in Lewiston, right? So the book is organized like Kathapodal, actually, right? Everything builds up to the center section, and then the center of the center section, and then away from that, right? It goes up the Clearwater River into Idaho. So, and as it goes, I get younger, because I go back into my childhood. So it's kind of doing many things at once. The first one is called Salmonberry Song, which is set at Seaview on the Long Beach Peninsula. My co-editor is Michael McDowell. He's a longtime friend for 30 years. And his family has a vacation house on Seaview, and it's been in the family for generations, right? And his mother is Elizabeth Ann McCracken McDowell, and at the time I wrote this poem, she's 85, and now she's more like 97, I believe. So, and she's also called Betty in this. Everybody knows her as Betty, but. Okay, Blue Jay was a trickster figure amongst the Chinook. The middle of this poem is on the Chinook Indians. And Cape Disappointment, many of you know what Cape Disappointment is up on the coast. That's the Washington side of the Columbia, mouth of the Columbia. It's a
lighthouse.
Yeah, yeah, there is. Doesn't look much like it did when Cook saw it, for reasons that are mentioned in the poem. Noontide shadows on sand at Seaview. Michael McDowell pursues with coats and shoes, his children dancing barefoot on spring surf that chases them and erases their tracks, draws them back to ocean's vast embrace. Elizabeth Ann McCracken McDowell, at 85, recounts the early days riding from Milwaukie to Seaview by wagon, horses high-stepping over the sand at low tide, horses emerging at twilight from the waves. In pink raincoat, blue jeans, and white tennies, Betty descends to the lighthouse at North Head, grandchildren bounding around her. At Halia, who casts her children to the sea, here redeemed by Our Lady of the Rocks. Like Blue Jay, who went to the land of ghosts, Lewis and Clark found themselves stranded on winter's coast where nothing seemed real, week after week of cold rain and dreadful squalls, the natives thievish, dirty, and small. But for Chinook, who had always lived there, wind, rain, and fog were spirit powers, whom they honored with hats, capes, canoes, and keeping warm in winter lodges, recounting how the world was made for people coming soon. Like Blue Jay, the Americans wanted to go home, to property, propriety, and plain dealing. So they did not know what they had been given. They did not know that death had already come to them, like the simple desire for sunshine. Betty sets the pace over sand and North Jetty, recalling workmen with trains dumping rocks, silting in the coastline from here to North Head, and Finnish settlers dynamiting the face of the Cape to make the ocean current convenient for ships. Along the trail on what remains of Cape Disappointment, Betty and Michael and Bill pause to ponder a single salmonberry blossom, 5-pointed purple star the size of a baby's open hand, dangling from April's bare brambles like a promise. Out on Long Beach, Americans gunning their cars leave tracks that following tides erase, drawing them back to ocean's vast embrace. The grateful people wanted Coyote to choose a wife, but Coyote said, "No, I have to go upriver now." I forgot to explain too about the Athalia, who was an ogress that lived in that area, and she would send people out on cradle boards to sea, and then the cradle boards would come back with only the bleached bones of the person on them. So she did that to Coyote, but when the cradle board came back, it was her bleached bones that were on it. So Coyote did a shuffle, and the people were grateful. They offered him a wife, and he says no. And so this is the Wasco cycle of Coyote going upriver. It's why I have the journey going upriver is to follow Coyote. Right? There's tales about him creating things all the way up the Columbia, and all the way into Idaho, actually, to Lapwai, which is 11 miles east of Lewiston. It's a fascinating, and it's out of print. It's hard to find. It should be in all of our cultural backgrounds, you know. It's I'm trying to, throughout this, trying to acknowledge the fact that there were people here 10,000 years before our ancestors. So it's not rip it off, acknowledge it. All right, there's a difference. Kelly Point, where's Kelly Point? Right, that's yeah, the Columbia, the Sauvie Island. When the Willamette comes to the Columbia, there's right, Kelly Point on one side, Sauvie's Island on the other. And Kelly Point was actually is named after a man named Hall Kelly, who was here in 1834, and he thought that there would be a city built there, right on the point of the Willamette and the Columbia, but it was a big marsh at that time, so it never happened, and it was never really developed. And he went back to Massachusetts and wrote endless tracts urging people to move to Oregon. And so he's the first booster that shows up in this. The booster is kind of the devil in this book. And Kelly Point is, Hall Kelly was the first booster, 1834. Right, trying to make something happen that, like get a dam put in or get a right, to make commerce happen, and having lots of unintended consequences. But Kelly Point is a place poem. All of these are place poems, aren't they? A place poem that is also a love poem. It's my contention, and Michael's too, that in Windfall, right, that any other kind of poem can be a place poem. Right, things happen in places that are important to us all. So this is a love poem. Like ghosts, we always return to the scene of our consummate tryst. Some 20 years ago or more, when we were married to others and crazy to be together. Late September, under a warm spell, I followed you along the cottonwood trail, leaves shimmering like hummingbirds. My hands caught up with your hips. You turned around and smiled. Slipping into the underbrush, I spread my jacket on fallen leaves, still wet from last night's rain. We shed some clothes and joined our bodies in communion for a time. Afterward, we sat on shore and watched Willamette ships receding toward the sea, upon Columbia's ambient tidal reach. The waves they made lapped gently at the sand beneath our feet. Such confluence was never foreseen when Oregon booster Hall J. Kelly dreamed a city rising in his lifetime, where underbrush and marshy land lay flooded half the year. Kelly never saw this point of his because it never existed. Before 2 million tons of river sand, dredged and dumped like loads of night, gave rise to black cottonwoods and wrens. Imagine, if you can, a piece of land, devoid of meaning and history, until we two came here and gave it time. Now Kelly Point's become a city park, and lovers stay discreetly on the path. Remember, if you can, the two of us, crazy to be together all the time. Like real people, we always return to where the long, impossible journey began, to the possible land of unconditional love. Right? The Army Corps of Engineers dredged the Columbia and the Willamette and dumped all that stuff there and virtually created what is today Kelly Point. If you go out and look at that, the sand is black. It's been pulled from the bottom of the river. Interesting what poking around in the history of the town can do. You know Milwaukie Island in the Columbia? Maybe it's up by just this side of the Dalles, near the town of Lyle, Washington, actually about a half a mile this side of Lyle, Washington. And if you pull up there, it's a rest stop today. And Milwaukie Island is where the natives buried people. Right? Milwaukie means place of the dead. And it was one of two islands, but Bonneville Dam buried one of them and reduced this one to a third of its former size, and all of the bones were moved and buried on actually the north side of the bridge that crosses the Columbia at the Dalles. There's a cemetery there. But if you go out there and look at that island today, there's a single tombstone sitting on it. Maybe you remember this if you've ever been up there. There's a single tombstone sitting out there. It's a white guy's tombstone. He was a man named Trevitt, Victor Trevitt, and he was a saloon keeper in the Dalles. And later he became a member of the legislature. But one of the things he did before he became a member of the legislature was that in 1861, right, gold was discovered in Idaho. So immediately, anybody that had a little bit of money bought a bunch of supplies and so forth and headed for Idaho, either to find gold or to supply those people who were finding gold, right? That is, get the gold from those people for food and things. And so Victor Trevitt got a load of supplies, joined a bunch of other people. They all got on a steamer and chugged up the river to Lewiston, what would later become Lewiston. And this is how Lewiston was founded in 1861. And this is called Trevitt's Estate. There's a little tiny park in Lewiston after Victor Trevitt. And this is sort of the story of Victor Trevitt in Lewiston. He was only there like a few months. And then, he made his money and got out, went back downriver, and got into the Oregon legislature. He ended up dying in San Francisco, of all places. And then he was shipped back up here and buried in the Columbia River. Amazing lives. Right, so Trevitt's Estate. May of 1861, stern-wheeler Colonel Wright landed his cargo of fortune hunters alongside the confluence, eager mud bank squatters on the Nez Perce Reservation. Victor Trevitt unpacked his consignment of miner's supplies and opened his canvas emporium for business. A few days later, 5 or 6 men were sitting on a log, shooting the breeze about what to name their outpost of progress. John Silcott reckoned they should honor some Indian chief. Just then Vic Trevitt stepped out of his tent and said, "Gentlemen, how about Lewiston, after Lewis and Clark?" Gentlemen agreed at once, and Vic Trevitt, who hailed from New Hampshire, Ohio, and Oregon by way of the Mexican War, decamped downriver to the Dalles to run the Mount Hood Saloon. Citizen Trevitt served 2 terms in Oregon's legislature. 10 years later, decamped to San Francisco, where he died. In 1883, under the terms of his will, Trevitt was buried beneath an obelisk on a mid-Columbia island. Memaloose, Immemorial Cemetery of Wasco and Wishram. Trevitt allowed how sporting men might come up short at the resurrection, so he would take his chances with the Indians. Lewiston established tiny Trevitt Park on the brow of Normal Hill. I remember running under elms and descending the steps to Idaho Street. My mother and I rested under the white gazebo overlooking town. After she died, I sat in Lawyer Cannon's office in the old Pinch house, overlooking Victor Trevitt's shady midsummer estate. I'd like to read a poem. This is in the very center of the book. There are the 3 poems in the very middle of the book are called The Music Lesson. I did 7 years on the clarinet. It was like a prison term in many ways because I was totally incompetent on the clarinet. Right? So music lesson was how the music lesson didn't work out. But something else did. Right? One door closes, another opens. So this is music lesson 3. And remembering the first poet that ever caught your attention? Can you remember the first poet that ever engaged you? Mine was Edna St. Vincent Millay. Mm-hmm. Sophomore year, the last required English class in high school, meant that no one had to be interested. So barely controlled chaos ruled our 1960 rude Republic of English. As spitwads flew and Big Stan Schnell flexed his tattoo and beautiful Babette doodled the hour away. A maven with true faith in the pearls she cast before us, Mrs. Lee, her large eyes focused somewhere over our heads, gave deathless voice to Edna St. Vincent Millay. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why, I have forgotten, and what arms have lain. Suddenly her voice was speaking directly to me. Sophomoric noise around me fell away. Suddenly I knew how words and lines coincide to say more than words and lines alone convey. Suddenly I had been granted the key to time's great mystery. Mrs. Lee tucked a strand of hair back into her French twist and brought the sonnet to a close with hand upraised. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. We came back down to earth on someone's loud guffaw. Beyond the mullioned windows of our small society, spring was blooming freely on 9th Avenue. The maples and birches were showing their chartreuse charm, and all of us knew that love would arrive any moment now. We were 16, and everything remained to be done. How you come to get involved with poems. My father worked for a logging company in the town, but he was an accountant. And But he started out in the profession working as a dozer pimp. A dozer pimp is the one who goes ahead of the bulldozer with an axe and cuts down stuff so that the dozer can come in and tear up the earth, right, to make a road, usually, a logging road. But that isn't where his soul was at all. His soul was on the river with a fishing pole in his hands. And I spent an awful lot of time with him on the river. And the river is way, after you go up the Clearwater River for 100 miles, right, there's the Middle Fork and the South Fork. And you go up the Middle Fork for 15 miles, and there's the Lochsaw and the Selway. And the Lochsaw is a stunning river. It's very steep-sided, so it's very rapid. Right? There are no terraces, as they say on this. Like if you go look at the Columbia or even the Clearwater, right, there are all these benches and terraces as it goes down to the river. But the Lochsaw has none. It's just totally steep-sided, and there's an uplift at the bottom, underneath the river, right, geologically. So the river is really fast, and even in the long, slow stretches of it, it's a terrible current under there. But it's fabulous to fish on, and I spent my whole childhood fishing on it pretty much. Especially right before the road went all the way through to Montana, and so there wasn't much traffic on it. And it was those times. So, Night River, the Lochsaw. Lochsaw in Salish means rough water. Long, drawn-out, foaming stretches hurtling down a canyon with no terraces, suddenly slowing down in deep green pools that slide by. Cold and transparent, the ancestor of all clear water, revealing every rounded rock and hovering trout below. Friday afternoon in mid-July, my father and I would leave the car at the campground, carry only creels, fly rods, and wallets of hackles, and scramble down warm granite rocks, late sunlight lingering on the water, an evening fly hatch well underway. Our object now was dinner, keeping everything we caught, casting S-curve filaments of spray backlit by sunshine, our hackles riding above and below the rocks and riffles. We reeled in small fry and the occasional 10-inch rainbow, renewing the ancient thrill of fish vibrating in our hands. As sunlight began to work its way up cedars on the far side, I watched my father casting into shadowy eddies, dark enigma within dark enigma, mind before mind. The Tao, right? What's the center line of this poem? The last rays retreated from the surface of the Lochsaw, lengthening ponderosa foreshadows of night. Our object now was dinner, as we cleaned our catch at river's edge and hiked back to camp in gathering dusk. I started a fire with cedar and tamarack as my father rolled fish in cornmeal to fry up with spuds in the iron skillet, renewing the ancient foretaste of fresh trout on the tongue. As darkness deepened around the hissing lantern, we unrolled sleeping bags on open ground, put out the light, and my father began to reconstruct in words the day's particulars. Brown hackles versus gray, light lingering on the river, the evening fly hatch well underway. Soon my father was remarking how the stars seemed so near, and so brilliant in the mountain air. And it seems to me we were passing through a great mystery, my father's voice, merging with the rush of rough water and stillness, my father's voice creating things in darkness on the Lochsaw. Several poems towards the end of this book are encounters with animals in the wild, according to Paul Shepard, right? The idea that we have to have this stage in our growing up, right? We don't become fully human until we've had encounters with animals in the wild. One of the great losses we have when so many of us live in cities and don't have these encounters. Pets don't count, right? So here's, and I had several such encounters, which I was glad to have had, and of course they make great occasions for poems. Here's a poem called Moose. and there was kind of a legendary figure in it. This takes place in a logging camp, because my father has had the job of going from logging camp to logging camp and doing the books. And so sometimes I get to tag along in the summers and run around logging camps all day. I'm the only kid, so I'm, it's like having a whole bunch of fathers everywhere. They're all lumberjacks and cooks and so forth. And there was one in particular, it was almost legendary, a man named Dooley Cramp. Isn't that a great name? If I were William Faulkner, I couldn't come up with a better character name than Dooley Cramp. It's up there with Flem Snopes. Moose. Well before I ever laid eyes on one, I was warned how rage could rise in the heart of a moose for no reason. The unconcerned creature ruminating a mouthful of grass suddenly charges the flat-footed greenhorn who can't outrun that huge long-legged stride, those sharply pounding hooves. The moose that hung around Camp 44 was an adolescent boy, a little older than me in moose years, tall and lanky. His legs no more than spindles supporting a top-heavy trunk, the wisp of a beard under his chin, mere nubs for horns, clearly no danger compared to moose with heavy racks and pictures. Dooley Cramp's encounter with moose was legendary. Seems the big bull would not budge from blocking the road, so Dooley pushed him with his pickup, and moose whirled, kicking out headlights and fenders with Dooley trapped inside, too cramped to maneuver his rifle from the rack behind his head. The adolescent moose in Camp 44 encountered me, standing on my lookout stump, eyes locked on his over a creek, and suddenly he ran toward me with inconceivable speed. For all his ungainly gait, crossing creek and covering ground like light, sending me on adrenaline flight to safety on the boardwalks. Moose Boy showed up again at dusk, casually munching weeds, drawing Dooley and fellow lumberjacks to witness the creature. A voice from the crew called out, "What do you see there, Dooley?" Bare-chested Dooley, hooking his thumbs in suspenders, holding up stagged black jeans, said, "Boys, I see me a rack of moose steaks." One more, called Elizabeth Lake. My father and I hiked up Elizabeth Creek to its source, a small lake found only on the map of my father's memory. 11 miles above the North Fork of the Clearwater, trout said to be so hungry they would fight to strike our flies, as when my father had once hiked in, caught his limit, and hiked out. I had never hiked so far and felt daunted by such steep trail, bearing my full pack through thimbleberry brush and August heat, until my father hushed me and pointed at 2 cow elk, looking back at us on the trail ahead, their bronze mantles the full ruff of rutting season glowing in afternoon sun. We passed fresh wallows along the creek and kept sharp eyes for bull elk and rut, the equal of moose for headlong rage. Darkness fell, and we had to roll out sleeping bags on a slope. All night long we heard elk crashing and snorting in the woods, sure their crazy rivalry would drive them pell-mell over us. Next morning my father shook me awake, and 50 yards above we came to our destination, sparkling in the sun. An acre of glacial cirque at the base of a high rock wall, rippling blue-green depths reflecting wilderness and sky, an invitation to fishermen to break out rods and flies. Today the trout refused to bite, so my father agreed to let me launch a makeshift raft I found among the reeds. Drifting to the center of the lake, I lay back naked like an image in the pupil of an eye, delighted to receive the sun, happy to inhabit this ancient, warm, and inexhaustible life. Thank you. Did you want some questions to be entertained.
Yes.
The man's name who you said that poetry should be put into books or put in books.
Jack Spicer.
That's,
Yeah. Check him out.
yeah, I will.
He's fascinating. He died in 1965 at the age of 40. He said, and when he died, supposedly his last words were, "My vocabulary did this to me." And that's the title. That's the title of the book that of his collected verse that's out now. It's, "My vocabulary did this to me."
If you only came to poetry when you were 16, when did you start writing?
About then. Right. So yeah, it's been a lifelong thing. Only 4 books or so, but that's fine. Right.
So what's your writing discipline and practice?
Well, mostly I just take it any way that it wants to come to me. And I get ideas, mostly in the mornings, I suppose I write. But they come to me in all kinds of ways, from reading things, from taking a shower, from dreams, from memories. As you can tell, memory plays a big part. Right? Memory is a great source. You shouldn't ever ignore that. And your childhood is great. I've had a lot of fun with this book and doing the childhood pieces.
How much exposure have you had to Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung?
I bypassed Campbell because, yeah, I think he misrepresents Jung, actually. So instead, I went directly to Jung.
Okay.
And I read, he wrote 20 volumes, and I read a dozen of them. And it's really good. Jung is a terrific writer. Right. Do not be misled by Campbell. And Campbell just ignores what he chooses to ignore in Jung and selectively draws on things. And, you know, some of those are quite fascinating as well. But you can go to Jung and get the whole package.
Why don't we see you at the lectures in Portland?
Yeah, I've belonged for quite a while. Yes. Right, I've been to a lot of those. Yeah, the Jung Society, you mean, right?
Friends of Jung.
Friends of Jung, yeah. Friends of Jung, right. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Jung took me the last 3 years, basically, I spent in deep study of Jung and Jungians. It's,
What are you working on now?
I have sort of 2 books going at once. One is a set of poems derived from European travels again, only very much more recent, right? And not around a theme like the fall of the Berlin Wall or anything. Although I do have a set of 4 around 2001 because we happened to be in Krakow, Poland on 9/11. So that was a huge impression. It took me 6 years to finally write that poem. Right? It was sat around in my head for 6 years before. But there's, and then I have another one going, which is a lot of more local here in this area, and about family. A lot of it's about family, kids, and struggles raising kids, and that sort of thing. So, but most of them using that same form that Kathapodal, that poem, which is I found to be a really flexible kind of form. You can do almost anything in it. So parallelism is a fabulous structure. I encourage everybody to try it out.
If there are any more questions,